They take the cast off and they start telling her to do push-ups. And I'm on the other side of the room freaking out. Like, this is going to be a lawsuit or something. Like, they can't do this. I'm literally beelining to them to go, don't take the cast off. Well, she was completely healed. I mean, they went back, got the x-ray, it was completely healed. And so those kinds of things begin to happen.
All right. I'm here with David Bradshaw, and this is the Awaken the Dawn podcast. Man, we've been looking forward to this. We've been wanting to do this for a while. Am I right? I mean, I'm stoked.
Yeah. Honestly, this has been months in the works.
Months.
Just to be able to connect in slightly longer form context. I'm excited, man.
Yeah. And we got a lot to cover and a lot of really cool, exciting things to talk about. And David, I'm curious if you could just share a little bit of like what the whole heart behind the Awaken the Dawn podcast is, what we're going to cover, who it's for, all of that, maybe people, that we can expect coming on as guests, that kind of thing. What are we looking forward to in the next coming months to a year of this whole podcast?
Yeah. I mean, I think, what's been in our heart for a long time is just that there are pioneering communities all over, not just America, but the nations, especially on university campuses, in cities, in regions that are really just pioneering presence-centered, gospel-driven communities. And in my opinion, that's the point of the Spear. More than a big event, more than, whatever else. That's really where the Great Commission happens. That's really where real life happens. It's like we talk about national movements, and really there isn't like a national movement. It's just local movements and communities in relationship with each other.
Yeah.
And so that's the point of the Spirit. And we just want to launch something to help pioneering communities move forward and get practical, like the School of Hard Knocks. What have we learned? Where did we fail? Where has it worked? So super practical, vulnerable, raw, but also theology and testimony and story and all of that. And some guests, amazing guests coming on. So I'm just excited to be able to start a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. So in other words, all the things, all the great things, in
everything.
And it can't
everything
get any
you
better.
Everything you could possibly want.
Ever imagine. Hey, one question I have, David, and I'm curious, because I've been hearing this phrase a lot, and I'm just wondering for people that may not be familiar with it. When you say presence-centered communities, what does that look like? What does that mean when you just maybe hear that in a conversation? Can you give some definition to that?
Yeah. I mean, I think like it's building and living together in such a way. So whether it's like a campus ministry, whether it's a citywide movement, a local church, but it's living in such a way that the highest priority is to attract the Lord.
Yeah.
And a lot of times that puts worship and prayer right in the middle, because that's the direct conversation. And even the term presence, can be confusing. It's like euphoric experience, but all we're really talking about with presence is when God is revealing himself tangibly in a real community of real people doing life. And that's what you read about in the book of Acts or church history or whatever. And I think it's the deepest desire of not only God's heart, but all of our hearts. I mean, we don't want just a shell religious forms and whatever. We want Jesus. We want to hear him, see him, behold him, walk with him in reality. And so how do you build together? How do you do life together in such a way where God's presence is actually the central attraction to what you're building, why you're building, where it's going, and just excited to go on that journey. And there's a lot in that conversation.
Right. I mean, I'll say this: if you're watching this or you're listening to it, if you could take that little clip of what David just said about presence-centered community, share it everywhere, because I think you put that in such just plain terms where I think I've had a lot of people ask, like, what does that really mean? Like, because they hear presence, like you said, and they're like, ooh, what presence, but it actually does look like something. It actually is modeled. You could actually look and see in scripture where this is not just, a new catchy thing. It actually is what we're meant to do. And it's exciting. And the cool thing is it's popping up all over the place. It's not a trend. It's becoming life. It's becoming, a part of the culture, which I think is really, really exciting. And also I think it's really great to have something like this to where you could have people that have been walking in this in big ways, maybe even in small ways, some in hidden ways, and be able to give people tools to really live this out. And I know you've actually been a part of something like this for quite a while. It started many, many years ago. I was wondering if you could maybe give us a little bit of insight into what that looked like, how it started, just wherever you want to take it from. But I find it to be a very inspiring and fascinating story, and was just curious if you wanted to share something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the key point in all of this is that God loves small. He loves weak.
Yeah.
He's not looking for flashy, or he's not necessarily looking for our charismatic personalities,
Right.
to drive the things, as valuable as all that is. I mean, it's like a lot of times we despise the things he loves, and so when we talk about presence-centered communities, or whatever, we use this language, it can start to sound so unattainable, just unreachable for normal people. But the reality is we're all normal people. And that's, I think, the journey we've had over the last, really couple of decades. I remember just years ago, somebody had the idea that we would pray 24/7 and for 3 days. And I actually remember thinking, this is the worst idea I've ever heard. I mean, I was just like, it sounds horrible. It sounds like just boring. And I mean, that wasn't even the word for it. I don't know. I used to always say, like, it's prayer in my mind was like going to the dentist.
Right,
It's like you do it because you have to, especially like corporate prayer, like group prayer.
Mhm.
I mean, I kind of had like a secret life with the Lord. I kind of got that, but like gathering for long hours of worship and prayer, that's not just, it's not a hype moment. It's one thing when you got 500 people in a room, or 1,000, or even just, 50, and there's like momentum, there's energy. But when you go nonstop, that most times not like that. It's 5 or 6 people at a time, a lot of times, and it just feels weak. And you're just like, man, so I thought it was a horrible idea, honestly. But I'll never forget that first time we ever did it. It was just a bunch of kids. I mean, 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds,
Wow.
and probably about 50 of them. And we went together for 3 days, 24/7. And it was worship. It was creativity. I mean, we literally plastered the walls with paper. Everybody's creating and drawing. I mean, it was just wildness. But the way that God showed up during those 3 days absolutely changed my whole life. I'd never seen anything like it. Like, I knew what it was like to be in a large worship moment where God's tangible presence was there. And I still love those moments. I mean, that hasn't changed.
Oh, they're the best.
But I didn't know what it was like to be with a community that was just living in that. And there was no hype. You could have five people in the room, and the way that the Lord met us, I remember saying, man, like, I've been in outpourings, but this was just like the Lord was dwelling, just resting. And for 3 days, it just went unbroken. All these kids are walking up to me, they're like 17, 18 years old. They're like, man, can we please never stop this? Why would we ever stop this? And kids, I remember one girl walked in off the streets, 3:00 in the morning, just heard the music, walks in off the streets, just literally falls down and gives her life to Jesus. It wasn't even like a moment for that. I mean, and then she ends up, now she's a missionary in the nations right now as we speak. And, these things begin to happen. I remember, one kid, I mean, things that you read about,
Right.
when you start to experience stuff that you've read about in books. Now, it's not like this all the time, by the way. I mean, there was many, many weak moments that almost felt like they didn't even matter. But when you start to just a little bit at a time begin to taste of things that you've read about, but it's your own personal little hidden community that nobody's ever heard of. And, I remember a girl right in the middle of these prayer meetings had a broken arm, and like had the pre-cast on it, and a bunch of kids are around her praying for her. And, they take the cast off and they start telling her to do push-ups. And I'm on the other side of the room freaking out. Like, this is going to be a lawsuit or something. Like, they can't do. So I'm literally beelining to them to go, don't take the cast off. Well, she was completely healed. I mean, they went back, got the x-ray, it was completely healed. And so those kinds of things began to happen. And I just remember thinking like, I think my whole paradigm of what ministry is supposed to look like, what community is supposed to look like, just shifted.
Right.
And I didn't even have a lot of theology for it yet. I just understood that when you prioritize, when you build in such a way that the conversation, the creative worship, prayer conversation with the Lord is right in the middle of how you do life, God begins to live in that in a different sort of way than anything I'd known. And honestly, it changed my whole life. Whole value set got flipped upside down, and it became life. I mean, 5 days a week, every day for decades, of just worship and prayer and interaction with the Lord, with others, and the stories and the storylines that came out of that for real, have been stunning. The things that God has done. And there's thousands of weak moments that we could look back on where it didn't feel like anything was happening at all. So it's all of that. But I think now I'm realizing it's the way Jesus has decided to lead.
Yep.
And that's the main thing. I mean, Jesus is leading the parade of history. He's the head of the church. He's really the architect, the creative genius. And he just decided in his genius that intimacy with him is going to be at the core of how he runs government, his government.
Yeah.
You know, his kingdom. It's like he goes, I'm going to do this in conversation and encounter with you. And he just decided that. That is literally the culture of the book of Acts. It's the culture of heaven, Revelation 4, 5, you know, it's the culture even all the way back to the tabernacle of David and the tabernacle of Moses. He always wanted to live with us in regions. And so when we live with kind of this humility, this brokenness, and this joy of worship and creativity and prayer and conversation, things begin to happen without any striving, that you could never produce in a million years. And I want to see a generation understand that, who they are, the level of access that they have to him is a pretty amazing thing. And I think most Christians don't even know what they have access to.
Right.
And how Jesus is leading this.
That's so true. That's so true. And I love that you mentioned, there's a few things I love that you mentioned that I think are really important. I love that you mentioned that there was many, many weak moments. I think that is so important to hear, you know, especially if you are wanting to cultivate something like this. I think sometimes you could see the big highlights, you could see the big moments, and you're like, this is how it has to be 24/7. But I think the beautiful thing is the weak, small, consistent moments lead to those glorious things, right? You know, they lead to, but like those weak moments are honestly where you gain the most strength, and you gain that consistency, and you learn to sit and be with Jesus and be with people, and nothing's happening, but you're with him. You're learning to minister to him. You're learning to listen to him. And I just think that's so important. And then the other thing that you said is that it really is where the Lord is wanting to interact. He's wanting his presence at the center. He's wanting the intimate relationship, not the you know, this thing where you feel like you're obligated to do a religious act, but no, it's actually it's the heart. It's the posturing of an entire community, and it's happening in a big way. I think we're seeing it in just I am floored as, and I'll show my age a little bit here, but as a late 80s baby. Okay. Wow. I'm floored at seeing where the church is and where we're going. Yeah. I see a lot of hope. I see a lot of presence-centered communities at the forefront, which just to be honest, I never thought I would have seen in my day. I just didn't. Maybe I didn't have enough faith. I think you thought it because you've been really plowing for it, but I just, for some reason, thought, you know, it'll always be the niche, but it's not. It's at the forefront, and it's moving forward. It to me, it's so exciting to see.
Well, I think people have an appetite for the authentic, and
absolutely,
you know, and there's just this sense of being done with the plastic, you know, version of spirituality, Christianity that we've all found it. And that affects all of us. I mean, I feel like what we don't want to do in a moment like this is come like, hey, we got it figured out, you know, we're figuring it out, you know, because we've tried to do the present-centered community and done it poorly, you know, because sometimes people get so vertical, they mess up relationships, and it's just like, we're all in process.
Yeah.
And so that definitely we're not like, hey, we got this, but I'm convinced that this is the way Jesus is leading,
Yeah.
and it works and it's practical. It's like King David in the Bible, he brought the ark in to Jerusalem. He hired, 4,000 musicians, and we don't even know how that was really structured, but it's an amazing statement. King David, he paid 4,000 musicians and 288 singers. And when he set up his government in Jerusalem, these things, this worship thing went day and night.
Right.
And because David understood, it wasn't even in the Torah or the law where it was required to do it that way. David understood what happens. He just understood what God is like, and what happens when we relate to him that way. And I think that pattern just goes over and over and over and over again. And we just want to validate, in spite of all the issues we've had, human weakness, that Jesus is still leading that way. Yes. And that I just believe it's time to figure it out together, have the conversations we need to have, about different errors that may have come up and human weakness and, stuff that we've learned the hard way. Honestly, I've learned the hard way in leading these kinds of communities, but I agree, man, it is everywhere, not only in America, but all over the world.
Yeah. All over. It's so awesome.
I mean, this is the way God's going to lead.
Absolutely. And I think another thing that maybe I'd like to hear your thoughts on, and that I think is important and often I think is avoided maybe, and maybe overlooked. Avoided is probably both. But what you said, the learning from the mistakes, the messy portion of this kind of thing. So we obviously here in Western culture, we're used to what church looks like and all this kind of stuff. What we're talking about, it's a bit of a new venture, right? It's a bit of like view it almost as a startup. I mean, if you would, but like kind of like we're trying something new. It gets a little messy, and it gets a little like we're not exactly sure how this goes and that kind of thing. How can people who are trying to do this have the conversations like what you're talking about of we're learning, we're growing? How can they engage in that? Like, is it talk to a leader? Is it talk amongst each other? Is it like just maybe give some insight of how people can move forward in this? Because I think sometimes people are so afraid of the mess and so afraid of the this and that it's not talked about. And I think with these kinds of things, it must be talked about. It must be expressed, and we have to grow and learn. And I think that key that you said, together, it's not just the one up here, it's the together. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's really important conversations we need to have, and just not be afraid to have them together with leaders. And I also think that we need to get convinced that Jesus is doing this, in a fundamental way. I remember, having been in these sort of worship, prayer, presence-based communities and movements and ministries and all of that, just having been around it for years. One of the things that has always struck me is that many people don't understand it in a really fundamental way. It's one of the most pragmatic things we could possibly do for the gospel, the Great Commission, making disciples, all the things we need to do. And I think helping people understand why and where, and that's part of the point of this podcast, is just to mine this out and kind of discover the way Jesus leads. So I think that's an important part of the conversation, is just to, it's one thing when we're pointing at different movements that have failed or done well, and they're like, and a lot of times people get around these things and they feel the Lord in them. Like, oh, that's really good. I like that place. It feels really good. But what they don't know is that was cultivated.
Yes, that's the word.
It didn't just fall on them.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like when you go to, I could name places, but when you go to certain places across America and the nations, where there's that sense of God is there, and everybody's like, you get in it and you sensed God, and there's that fruit, right, of what happens when God is present with a community of people. And we know he's always present, but I'm talking about a community that's cooperating with him or living with him in such a way where he's revealing himself powerfully through them, weak people.
Right.
And you can see that, and everybody's like, oh man, I love, these different ministries, these different locations, and they travel from all over the world, and they're like, I want to be there. But what a lot of times I think they don't realize is that they can have it.
Yep,
they can have
so
it.
Good. Yeah.
You don't have to go there to get it. You can get it in your community. That's what they need.
Right.
And if we could understand it, everybody can have it. Everybody can have the Lord if you desire him. Everybody. And what they also don't understand is that those places have an entire root system of like this cultivating and this journey and the ups and the downs of that and the process of it. And you get into their end of the year conference or whatever, and you're like, whoa, and you do feel, and it's real. It's authentic. It has, I would use the phrase authority, spiritual authority is on it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But that came from a journey with the Lord. And there's a process, and it's not earning something. It's not like dead works. Like we got to work something up and try to get God's attention. That's settled at the cross, right? Like we already have his attention. We're not trying to get his attention, but there is a way that he leads and a way that he reveals himself. And it's just intimacy with him. It's the way it really is what we were born for.
Right.
And so we want to call that out for those that are maybe watching this. Tune into this podcast because we want to call it out of you and us and learn together and have candid, hard conversations, get into theology and understand who God is and how he is building. And then, number 3, tell stories.
Yeah.
Bring in voices across the nation and the world that are doing this and just mine it out of them, pull it out of their hearts. How did this happen in your life? And so we're going to do that in this podcast. I'm really excited.
Yeah. And speaking of, I would love to dive in, obviously on Awaken the Dawn story, your story, and I know we'll probably do that in the next couple of episodes here, but there's some amazing stuff that has happened. And this is somebody, spoiler alert, that works with the organization, but I haven't been here for the whole time. And just even seeing and hearing the stories before I even was a part of Awaken the Dawn was quite fascinating because y'all started, from what I've observed, a small little room, small little group of people in Virginia near DC. And then, some pretty astounding things happened. And I don't say that in any kind of hyper way. I'm saying that as somebody who actually was watching it from afar. Some pretty astounding things happen and continue to happen. And I'd love to dive into that story at some point. You think we can go there? You're cool with that? Yeah, we got it. We got to tackle that at some point.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, if we go back even to the time frame I was talking about earlier, where it was small, it was weak. I still feel like it's small and weak when we're honest with ourselves.
Hey, which is a great thing.
I mean, that's probably true of everyone. Not everybody no one lives in the big event mode all the time. We're not supposed to. They're amazing, but
we'd be passed out, exhausted.
Yeah, we'd never lived through it.
Never.
Yeah, but I think like those early days, it's like God is building something in our journey, and there's gold in those early seasons. And so for us, we started small room, small group of people. I remember when we started worshiping and praying on a daily basis with other people. Now I know many people can't do that based on different jobs and assignments, and they're not even supposed to necessarily. But in our case, when it went daily, it was a huge, it shifted everything in our world. And so it was honestly just me and it was a handful of people. And so we began to worship and pray and do life together in that way. And the goal, the heart was not just, hey, let's have really good. And this is where people have to understand. It's not like, let's just have, good meetings that feel good. We want to see like an awakening. People far from God know him. This is not just about us. It's about the way that Jesus is going to fulfill the things that are in his heart and his will and his kingdom. And so anyway, so it started small, and every day And this went on for months. I mean, many, many months. And I remember we did our first ever gathering it was like young adults. And we'd never had anything like that before. And it ended up being that like 500 or 600 of them showed up, from all over the region. At the time, it felt like thousands, but I'll never forget, because we prayed. It was 21 days. We would worship 24/7 for 21 days and pray and just go low. And it felt weak. It was powerful. But at the same time, I remember right in the middle of, I think it might've been the second time we did it, but there's so many stories, they get mixed up. But this one time in the middle of the night, we were praying. I was praying for, and these sound like charismatic phrases, but it's just, they're in the Bible too, but open heavens. I would pray for that. I'd be like, Lord, come on. We got 1,500 kids. The first year was 600 kids. The next year we did a big event. It like went to over 1,000, 1,500 or something. And I'm like going 1,500 18-year-olds, from all over the East Coast are coming in this room in 3 weeks. And every day, probably 50 times a day, I'd be like, Lord, we need something we could never produce. And I pray for them. And I was praying in the middle of the night. One of these, there was like 4 or 5 girls in the like 2-3 a.m. Time slot, doors locked. They're in there just going after the Lord. It's like 3 a.m. and they're all like 17 years old, and we're all praying these same things for this group of kids that are about to show up, and just for the Lord to be known, and just even prayers that are in the Bible, open a door for your word, those kinds of prayers. And we're just, it's weak. And it's these 4 or 5 girls, it's like 3 a.m. They're in there. And one of these girls just has this internal vision, just an impression. She saw a lightning bolt come down, and it just stayed like a permanent lightning bolt. And she was like, God wants to do something that lasts. And these are like 17-year-olds. And they're like, so they're praying, they drew it on the thing on the wall, and they're all like, permanent lightning, permanent. And while they're praying it, real lightning strikes the building. They're literally mid-sentence on this, and lightning hits the building. I wake up to like text messages like, you won't believe what just happened. We were praying for a lightning bolt, and it really struck the building like real lightning. And it put this hole in the ceiling of the building right above where like the podium was in this church building where we were going to host these thousands of young people. And we had to put a bucket to catch the rainwater from the hole, from the lightning bolt that the girls prayed in at 3 a.m. Wow. And then I'll never forget that event. We prayed all those 21 days straight. And I'll never forget the session. A friend of mine was speaking, and it was like the Lord came into the room. I mean, the Lord came into the room, and I remember just weeping and uncontrollably, the whole room. And there's one thing where you're in a moment where it's kind of hypey, and it's another thing when the Lord begins to reveal himself in a gathering where no one can deny the Lord's here. Right. And that's what happened. And we just wept, and I don't even know what happened. I was supposed to be leading it, but we were undone. And this went on and on. I'll never forget the end of that. This kid walks up to me, and he's like, he just collapses. He collapses on my shoulder, and he's crying. My shirt's soaked. This kid's probably 16, and he goes, I'm never going to be the same. He goes, I don't even know what happened. That kid's now full-time ministry missionary, giving himself. But that's what began to happen with just hundreds and hundreds of these young people that then launched out and they started their own thing. And that's what we want everybody to know. Yes. You don't have to come to our thing except to maybe get fed and just, get some strength or encouragement or whatever. But like you can do it just as good as Upper Room or Jesus Image or Awaken the Dawn or whatever it happens to be. You can do it. It may not be globally known. You may not have a global platform, but that's not really the main point, is it? I mean, and I feel like, so that those early days marked us, I mean, it just became so tangible. I mean, I remember people would walk in the room. I happened to be leading worship at one of those at that early time. I mean, we did 21 days. I think it was the opening set, and we wrote a bunch of songs, which, by the way, if you're in one of these communities, you have to start writing songs.
Yes. Write the songs.
Because God, this whole language out of your interaction with the Lord begins to come, and there's authority on that. Every move of God in history songs were written, and so so we wrote a bunch of songs and out of it. And I remember we were leading these songs we'd just written. And it was one of the few times in my life I can remember where it was like the presence of God was so tangible in that room. We got to the point with the band where we couldn't even play anymore. And everybody just put their instruments down, laid on the ground, and we all just cried. And wow. I remember thinking, I'm in this moment. I remember thinking, I've never been here before, where there's 1,500 people in the room and the Lord took over the room. Yeah. And I remembered all those weeks where I was like, Lord, do what we could never do. Open. And we waited on the Lord. And, there's 50 stories like that out of that time frame where, I'll tell you one more. That there was a girl who was right there in the middle of that. And she had one lung. You're supposed to have two, right? She only had one. And she was just like worshiping. And it got to this moment where everyone was dancing and she was. And usually she would get winded like really fast because she only had one lung. And this was a friend of my wife's family. And she, anyway, all of a sudden she realized she can breathe. She goes back to the, I guess get an x-ray because we know them. So we followed up and the Lord had just given her second lung back. Literally she had two lungs and nobody prayed for her. It was just worship, and I share these things. There was, again, many of these types of things, but you pinch yourself because you go, why? We're nobody.
Right.
When you hear about the, famous leader and they tell a few stories, you're like, well, of course. But I'm talking about small, weak communities. It wasn't 1,000 people. It was like 30 or 40 of us that were going after this for 21 days at a time of just worship and songwriting and Bible and praying and, just going low, and working on our relationships. Because by the way, God's as interested in the horizontal as he is the vertical. So
yes, that's big.
Inevitably you work on that. And we didn't do it all right. But I just want to say, like, in the midst of that, when this stuff starts to happen to you, you start to realize, it just radically changes your whole perspective, your whole worldview. And that's what happened to us. And so we realized this is the rest of our life. And I then begin to find it in the Bible, Genesis to Revelation. It's just there all the way from the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve walked with the Lord in the coolness of the day. And the Lord said to be fruitful and multiply. And there was that sense of, it was in their union with the Lord that everything happened, and then you go all the way through the Old Testament, all the way through the life and ministry of Jesus and the apostles and the book of Acts and the early church. The big launching party of the church was the day of Pentecost. And what happened? God showed up in the geographic place with a real community, and 3,000 were added in one message. And that wasn't because Peter was eloquent in Acts chapter 2. It was because God was there. And so I believe it is the culture. It is the prototype, even in our weakness, that God wants to do that with weak people, with your campus group, with your local church, with your region-wide expression, whatever it is. God is going to do this. We don't have to work it up, hype it up. It's just the way Jesus is leading. And so those early days, like you mentioned, they really, really marked us. And then eventually we started doing it 18 hours a day, 5 days a week, and that's not for everybody. That's not to say that that's what every church needs to be doing in order to be a presence-centered community. But in our environment, it's what really worked. But we did find that things were birthed when we related to the Lord that way. I want to say this just clearly. You can't relate to the Lord that way and not have fruit. Mm-hmm. It'll never happen. Let's settle the score. You can't draw near to the Lord in authenticity. You can do it in all kinds of like pharisaical weirdness of performance. Yeah, that's just dumb. But like when you do it and it's authentic and it's sincere, you can't not have fruit. It will produce something. So
I like that you said that's just dumb. It's just dumb. It's true. It's true. You
if
a better way.
If you're watching this and you're doing that, you are dumb. I'm just kidding. We love you.
We do. That was really, really, thank you. That really made me happy. No, but that's really good, David, because I think people need to hear and see this side of the story a lot of
Yeah.
times, because people can look and see, Awaken the Dawn, National Mall, 2017, 50,000 people, and immediately probably think, oh, that happened overnight, or, this has always been what it was. But I think people need to hear it. And I'm looking forward to having even more voices that are in the midst of this, that are making big impacts, and to hear, how did it start? What were some of the things you went through? Like, I think these things are so important. And even to hear from people that you may have never even heard of, but man, they are just as impactful and just as important to the Lord as anybody else, and are doing things that are moving culture, moving people's hearts. It's just so cool. One of the things I love, and that drew me to Awaken the Dawn, and this isn't an Awaken the Dawn plug, okay? I'm just saying this is a part of the Presence Center community thing that I love. And Awaken the Dawn, I think, has always modeled this, is that the empowerment for people that are involved in things like this. Because I think a lot of times in Western culture, it's been set up like, you got the people up here and then everybody else comes and attends church. But man, in these presence-centered communities, these presence-centered cultures, these things that you are talking about, it's like we're in this together. We are growing together. There is like, obviously there's the leaders and stuff like that, but like there is just this empowerment of, you can do this. And as you guys that are watching and listening, the thing is, I think if you could walk away with anything from any of these episodes, is that you can do this. And we're not talking about the big events. Maybe that will be some of you, but what we're talking about is that you can cultivate, if it be 5 people, if it be 500 or 5,000, you can cultivate this kind of community. And it's not just like I said, not just a trendy thing. This is actually something that the Lord is saying, this is where I want to go. This is how I'm leading. And I just think that's just such a inspiring thing with this presence-centered lifestyle, is that there's just this culture of empowerment. And it's beautiful to be able to see someone who never thought that they could be a part of a ministry or do this and do that, be like, no, you could do this. You could be a part. You could have a voice in this. Your voice actually matters in these moments and in these. It's just awesome. So yeah, I mean, we could talk about this for hours and days and months, and which I'm guessing we will. But yeah, we're in a cool space right now, David. I think just as a church in general, we're just in a cool place, and I am just thrilled to see where this is going. So
I think it's going to be an exciting journey. And we want to walk it with you. I agree.
Yes.
If there's nothing else, we want to empower and encourage you that you can do this in your community. And it can be a bit disruptive, because the invitation is to seek God's face and to be reconciled with one another, because that's the dynamic of what this actually looks like. But if you build in such a way to say, you know what, like in our campus ministry, what if we built with our primary goal is to attract Jesus, not just to attract people?
Yeah.
I think that's the disruptiveness of it. But ultimately, it is all about loving people. And it's just that when the Lord is the center stage, we love people better. And but what if in your local church, what if you allowed it to get disrupted? What if you're leading a church, what if you did daily worship with your team? For those that if you happen to be in ministry, a lot of people in ministry they don't do it. They don't relate to the Lord, as a community in any kind of regular, and it doesn't have to be daily. I'm just saying, what if you put it right in the middle of how you're building what you're, and then let God be God. And I'm telling you, that's what we want. We want something that we can tell our kids the stories, and they're going to go, wow, God's alive. I don't know about you. What I want in my life. There's nothing less than that can work. And that's, communion and, the sacraments are part of that. Worship and prayer is part of that. The Bible is part of that. Authentic relationships, humility, vulnerability, all of these things are ingredients. But the point of all of that is that Jesus would, like, for real, be known.
Yes.
And so we want to say, you can do it. Everybody gets to play. Everybody's voice is part of this. And if over the next months, if we can bring guests on and you can get their stories, get theology, learn from, honest, vulnerable conversations as leaders, about mistakes, things that have worked, things that haven't. That's what we want to do. Because yes, we're going back to the National Mall. Yes, we're going to have big moments that they're catalytic. But the real thing is not the big moment. The real thing is every day in your campus ministry and in a local church and in a family or whatever. That's what this is actually for. That's even what the catalytic moments are for. So if we can get in the conversation, I want to encourage you, track with us. Check out these episodes. Check out the guests we're going to bring on. Check out the stories. Check out the theology. Check out the, even the vulnerable conversations that we're going to have. And let's go there, because Jesus is going to build this way. So we want to just be with him.
Absolutely. I think we should have an episode that's just David Bradshaw's biggest mistakes. And we'll just kind of rank them from like 1 to, you think we'll have 100 will be enough? What do you think?
100 might not be enough. If you're gonna break it down to the biggest mistake, we could probably do a top 10.
Okay, top 10. Okay, yeah. And then we'll just do a top 10. It'll be amazing.
I don't know if I'm committing to this live right now, but
oh, we're committing. We're committing.
I'm open. I am really open.
Yeah, that would be pretty cool. But
that's probably the one that's going to go viral. That would be the one.
I couldn't imagine any other one going viral. Now here's this. We are going to cover a lot of stuff as we continue to go on with these episodes. But you did mention something that as we wrap this one up, that I do want to say we are going to talk a little bit more about. But I just want to kind of throw a little teaser out there, and then we can maybe talk about this more in coming episodes. But you mentioned we're going back to the National Mall. Can you give like 1 minute little teaser on that, David?
So here's the teaser. We're going back to the National Mall. It's been 7 years.
Yeah.
In 2017, we were on the National Mall with 58 tents and 1,700 worship teams, tens of thousands of people. And it was all about everything we're talking about. The Lord's presence and the gospel at the center of our nation. And there are hundreds of stories out of that. But we didn't want to just do that again to do it. I mean, it worked. And everybody was like, when are you doing it again? It was like, it was too holy. And we just didn't feel like we could just hit repeat. But in the last, 4 or 5 months or so, we felt again for the first time in 7 years that the Lord was giving a green light to this. And so we're going to go back in October of 2025 with the tents and the musicians. It's a festival around the presence of God and the gospel for a new generation, for Gen Z, for Gen Alpha, but for all ages as well. And then we're going to culminate, and this is new. We're going to end the gathering on the last day with a communion table the length of the whole mall, because we want to end with the body and the blood of Jesus. Because really, I think that's where our heart is. The presence of God and the body and the blood of Christ are what shifts a generation. We've had a lot of external, there's a lot of things moving that are important politically and other places. But to see the heart of a generation shift, it's God's presence and it's the gospel and it's the body and the blood of Jesus that actually shifts a nation and a generation. So we're going to gather. We're still figuring out all the details on this logistically. But
like how long is the National Mall? Like,
it's over a mile. I mean, we're talking about
it's going to be over a mile long.
We might have to break for some roads. We might have to break. I mean, we'd like to not, but the idea is that it's going to be, we're actually going to come together, not just eyes on Jesus, but also eyes on, the Christ is in one another. So we're going to sit at the table. We're going to take the body and the blood of Jesus and just plead the blood of Jesus over a whole generation. I don't know, man. I feel like something is brewing here that is absolutely wild. So that was more than a minute, but there it is.
No, that's good. We'll definitely be talking more about it, but be looking forward to that. And I'm sure more information is going to be coming your way. Hey, and so as we're wrapping up, I do want to say a couple of things. Check out awakenthedawn.com if you can. You can get all kinds of updates there, including about the National Mall, where we're going. I'm sure we're going to be all over the place, right, David? As we're leading up to the National Mall,
yes.
Awaken the Dawn is going to be all over the nation, including if you want to have Awaken the Dawn in your area, if it be worship, David Bradshaw, all of it together. Just find
not worship, not worship David Bradshaw.
Not worship David Bradshaw, worship, or David Bradshaw. We could have David Bradshaw. Sorry, that was so funny. Do not edit this one out. That's good. That was hilarious. But anyway, check us out there, and then obviously social media. Facebook, Instagram. We just want to be connected. As we were talking about, we want to be in this together. And so it's not about gaining followers, but actually gaining family and just doing this together. And so check us out. And hey, we'll be talking more here on the Awaken the Dawn podcast. We're going to cover all kinds of stuff. We'll see you next time. I'm David Valier. That's when you say I'm David Bradshaw. Okay. We'll talk to you next time. See you.